Fashion is simultaneously one of the most political art forms, but also apolitical art forms. It contradicts its own nature because as an art form, it can be seen as the ultimate social signifier of political or cultural values. But it is also the art form which can be most directly discredited as simply an aesthetic or functional product. While subcultures like punk have used fashion and style to express one's values, or roots of moral affiliation, at the pinnacle of what is considered peak artistic expression, the fashion runway, a complete collection of a true artist in fashion's work, what we see is a profound absence, more often than not, of any direct statements regarding current political climate or firm ideological stances. It's why fashion is often discredited by many artistic critics. But there's one designer I'd like to talk about who isn't afraid to take a stance through his artistic ambition in fashion, and that's Jun Takahashi of Undercover and his collection, Scab. What's good, everybody? My name is Karsten Kraning. I am a fashion designer and a sort of fashion cultural commentator. And today I want to dive in and talk about one of the most challenging collections ever released, which is Jun Takahashi of Undercover and his 2003 Paris debut, Scab. We're not only going to dive in about what makes this collection cool and unique, but we're also going to talk about why it was such a bold and risky move for Jun Takahashi, and how this collection could have basically cost him his entire career at the time. So why did this collection by Jun Takahashi almost derail his entire career and legacy? Let's get into it right now. First, let's talk a little bit about the context and the climate in which Jun Takahashi would make this debut collection, Scab. Jun Takahashi was creating Scab in the aftermath of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, in which a terrorist attack on the World Trade Center in New York would push the US's Bush administration to declare a war on terror. This war on terror was to try to counter Al-Qaeda organization run by Osama bin Laden. Now, this operation originally started when the US would invade Afghanistan, whose Taliban government was believed to be working with and harboring Osama bin Laden, as well as the rest of the Al-Qaeda terrorist cells. The war on terror sort of became a continuous threat against a lot of different countries in the Middle East. In the aftermath of the invasion of Afghanistan, US aggression in the Middle East in general grew quite a lot, and it started to be clear that the US may use military actions on other countries in the Middle East. This most clearly played out with the invasion of Iraq, where the US accused Saddam Hussein and his government of harboring and supporting Al-Qaeda. The war on terror was a really confusing time to be a Western citizen, most notably a US citizen. The 24/7 news media was covering and documenting US aggression and conflict in the Middle East, but it was so tied to propaganda that the general US population, even today, sort of lacks an understanding of true narrative of what really happened during the Bush administration's war on terror. Now, socially speaking, in the years directly following 9/11, to question any US authority or any of the actions or conflicts that were happening in the Middle East, you were met with quite a lot of backlash. If you lived in the US and you were against the war on terror, whether that be the invasion of Afghanistan or the invasion of Iraq, you were considered extremely unpatriotic, and the social backlash would be pretty extreme at the time. For example, if you were someone who was in the media or a public figure, you could risk being deplatformed for criticizing the war on terror. You could be socially excommunicated from a lot of people, whether that be colleagues, friends, neighbors, and in many circumstances, protesting or standing against the war on terror could in some circumstances risk your job or your career. You'll notice art that met or questioned the US involvement in the Middle East was highly controversial and scrutinized, especially in those first few years after 9/11. And this was very much the time or the context in which Jun Takahashi would create Scab. Directly after the war in Afghanistan and when hostility towards Iraq was starting to ramp up. At the time that Jun Takahashi started creating this collection, criticizing the US in any way would have been considered career suicide to some degree. Now, Jun Takahashi is a Japanese designer. He's known for making a combination of streetwear and sort of this punk style. Originally, Undercover, his brand, was just printing punk-inspired t-shirts with graphics he made out of a store he shared with Nigo of Bathing Ape. Now, while it had these very humble origins, his brand Undercover would continue gaining momentum as Jun would produce more. Eventually, eventually he would garner the attention of Rei Kawakubo of Comme des Garçons. Comme des Garçons was one of the most well-respected Japanese brands of all time. So when Rei Kawakubo started mentoring the young Jun Takahashi, this was a very big deal. And she began to champion him and attempt to get his work to Paris. Now at this time, just for a little context, the internet was very, very young, and being a designer in Japan was highly isolating at the time and basically meant you had a Japanese audience and that's it. So the only way to get an international market and to start getting attention from international art critic as well as international fashion buyers was to take your collection from Japan and present it in Paris. It was really the only way a designer at the time could take their business to the next level and not just be involved in their local market. And this is also how you kind of put in your own way to sort of get the artistic and critical success you would desire as well. So Rei Kawakubo is going to champion Jun Takahashi and support him and bring him to Paris. She's setting him up so that he can show the real whole fashion world his face and his work for the first time. So what is he going to do in this opportunity? How is he going to show the fashion and artistic world who he is with this very rare, very important opportunity that not a lot of designers get at the time? He is going to criticize the US's conflict in the Middle East. This would be considered not only artistic suicide at the time, but economic suicide. While showing in Paris is of course not showing in the US, there is still a massive stake in what is considered US values. Now we can recognize that Jun sort of has an advantage at being a Japanese citizen. That allows him to hold an opinion like this, to scrutinize or criticize the US, though there will sort of be a softening to it because he is Japanese. But again, this doesn't mean he doesn't have any skin in the game. So for him to tie this heartfelt conviction to possibly his only moment to make it in his career, this debut Paris Fashion Week collection is the make or break moment in his career. There were no other designers even daring to touch the war on terror with a 20-foot pole because they thought the economic or social repercussions of it would cost them their career. So what did Jun actually present on the runway at Scab, and how did it tie into the war on terror and a reaction of it? The name Scab comes from a technique or a method of clothing construction that Jun Takahashi would use the most throughout this collection. Scabbing is an unofficial term for a sort of patching technique that is used to repair clothes and attach patches, and this technique is both for aesthetic and functional purposes, but also carries a heavy cultural weight. The technique of scabbing is most notably attached to crust punk subculture. And crust punk is really important to this collection. There are references to crust punk all throughout this collection beyond the somewhat obscure sewing technique that it's most heavily associated to. You could think of crust punk as almost a more elite, refined offshoot of punk, while punk at its genesis was really about political dissent and rebellion. As the expression and the art would begin to evolve more from the 70s to the 80s, the connotations of punk culture were beginning to fade and also become commercialized. And crust punk was sort of created out of this desire for more clear political roots. Crust punk music has clear themes of environmentalism, but also sort of this social anarchy lifestyle. Crust punk is staunchly anti-capitalist, which has led many crust punks to take on this lifestyle to remove yourself from society and therefore remove yourself from capitalism. And many crust punks do this by intentionally becoming homeless in a sense. But this sort of lifestyle and culture is what led to many crust punks repairing their clothes rather than buying new ones, and how the scabbing technique came to be. Now, the technique of scabbing is all throughout Jun's collection. Most of the looks or pieces feature some sort of scabbing technique in one way or another. What's really interesting about this is that scabbing in the culture of crust punks is mainly only used for jeans, vests, and shirts. But in this collection, you see Jun using the scabbing technique with these very graceful or elegant women's wear pieces. There is also a level of nuance to Jun being a Japanese person, using this sort of untraditional repair method, because there's a lot of cultural context and nuance with the very similar and adjacent repair method known as boro. Now, crust punk is not only referenced through the scabbing technique, but also through the graphics on the items. Particularly the band Sedition, a crust punk band, has graphics from their Earthbeat LP all throughout the collection. This album is all about Native Americans and the tragedy they face at the hands of the US government. There are a lot of samples of Native American music in it and voice clips of Native Americans talking about how they have been personally affected. And there is a very clear parallel that Jun Takahashi is trying to make here with the way that Native Americans have been treated by the US government. Now, the tragedy that the Native Americans faced at the hand of the US government is not just only expressed through this Sedition Earthbeat LP, but also through some of the fabric choices that are used during scab. We'll see some garments have some Native American inspired fabric and fabric techniques with them. And this is sort of to call back to this theme of the United States oppression of Native American people. But Jun doesn't just take fabrics that are traditionally from Native American people, but also he sort of takes a lot of traditionally Middle Eastern adornment, such as jewelry styling, the print patterns, and the fabrics, all which reference traditional Middle Eastern fashion. So what you'll see is often in the same look, there will be a piece of clothing that references Middle Eastern culture and their sort of traditional styling. And then there will also be a piece of clothing which references very clearly Native American styling. He is making a very clear parallel between the sufferings of the Native American people that happened in the past and that which may be happening to those in the Middle East. These are three very unique cultural ideas and themes that are coming together here. The atrocities that the Native American people suffered at the hands of the US government, the atrocities that are happening now in the Middle East, and sort of the crust punk ideals. But this is only clear in retrospect, and you'd have to do some research to sort of understand that. And if you were watching the show in real time, this wouldn't be a clear political statement. When the actual show was presented, the opening look would be this dark figure cloaked in a black shroud. It almost sort of looks like an angel of death or a grim reaper or the morning of something really, really haunting. If you were to see this collection for the first time, there would probably be some question in your head if this look is supposed to represent something vaguely Middle Eastern, as there is some resemblance. Some of the adornment and fabric techniques seem to be somewhat referential or similar to Middle Eastern dress, but it's not like a clear direct reference. This would sort of go into the viewer's subconscious, and they would probably be saying, is that what I think it is? Perhaps this sort of dark figure is supposed to represent the concept of grief itself, but this little sort of subconscious question Jun plays with throughout the collection, because his references to Middle Eastern styling are clear, but also not completely obvious of what he's trying to say, especially if you were watching it for the first time. To the people watching it the whole time, it would probably be running in their heads is he referencing what I think he's referencing? What is he saying with that? Jun is very much playing with a subconscious question when you're watching it. It's not clear what he's saying unless you're a crazy cultural researcher, which just most of the people in the audience weren't at the time. And then the show ends, and there's a moment where everyone thinks it's over, and Jun sort of fakes out the crowd. And then he starts it back up again in this sort of surprise move. And then you have models walk out in what are very clearly burqas. Burqas that are brightly colored and transparent. Now, everything before this was a political statement if you dived really deeply into it. Jun having his models walk out in burqas in the aftermath of 9/11 is an insane thing to do. It very much made it clear for everybody there what the whole collection was about, and a direct statement on where Jun stood with it. The whole collection is a political statement around the suffering around the people in the Middle East that would come from the US's war on terror. And this statement would really shock a lot of the buyers in Paris and the fashion media. While it probably could have costed him his career if he presented it a few months earlier, or at least a lot of social respect, instead it created a reputation for Jun that led him to be one of the most respected designers of that era. Nobody was brave enough to talk about the war on terror at that time. Jun was sort of the first person in that artistic circle to break the ice. Jun Takahashi certainly again had this luxury and privilege of being a Japanese citizen that allowed him to make this statement. This is a statement that an American designer could not have made at that time due to the social conditions. It also certainly helped that he had been backed by Comme des Garçons as a financial entity in some regards. And so all this to say is that Jun was certainly putting a lot on the line, but he had a little bit of a cushion. And while we can sort of take that cushion and disregard it and say that Jun just had the privilege, I think this is an amazing example of how one's own privilege or luxuries can be exercised to do more good when one has more resources than another in a situation like this. It also means they have a greater responsibility. Rei Kawakubo would say after this collection about Jun is that he was the only person to ever have the courage to say something and to say something directly. And looking at the 25 last years in fashion, he is still one of the few designers to have the courage to say something. And that's what makes Scab such an interesting collection, especially in the context of the time it comes from. Anyways, if you enjoyed this video and you want to see more, follow me. You can subscribe to my YouTube channel. And if you want to see a little bit more of my own designs as a clothing designer, my Instagram and website is also down below. Thank you all for watching this video, and I hope you have a great day.